Oh, what up YouTube? Welcome back to the channel. I'm Frody. I got a couple of questions for you. When was the last time you got into an argument? In fact, how often do you get into arguments? Do you enjoy arguments? Do you enjoy verbal conflicts? What if I told you there was a superpower that you could acquire that would significantly reduce and even prevent future arguments and conflicts in your life? How much money would you be willing to pay for that? Now, what if I told you you could acquire this actual superpower free 99? Would you be interested? A few years ago, I read this book. It's called Pause and Listen, The Art of Active Listening. And one of the biggest takeaways I got from this book is that most, if not all, arguments are a byproduct of a lack of listening. And the reason is because there's a great quote by Stephen Covey that says, most people don't listen with the intent to understand. Instead, they listen with the intent to respond and reply. So if you think about it, you're having a conversation with somebody, and while they're talking, you're thinking about your response. In many cases, many of us are like, battle rappers in that sense. That is something that I could actually attest to, because prior to reading this book, I was infamous for doing that. As somebody else was talking, in my mind, I was waiting for them to be done so I could...
We're gonna get this work. We're gonna get this work.
So what happens as a result of that? We experience a couple of things. One is miscommunication, misunderstanding, misinterpretation, assumptions. These are all the ingredients of a verbal conflict / argument. So when you think about it from that perspective, the antidote to, arguments and verbal conflict is actually active listening. Active listening, in other words, is also known as empathetic listening. It's also known as mindful listening. It's also known as reflective listening. And what it is, simply put, is this practice of listening for the sole purpose of understanding. See, many of us, myself included, were never taught how to actively listen. I don't know, maybe you're different. Did you ever take a class in high school, in middle school, in college about active listening? I can remember vividly growing up, many adults, family members, various teachers, all told me, this boy don't know how to listen. You don't know how to listen. This boy don't know how to listen. And interestingly enough, none of them, not a single one of them ever sat me down to actually teach me how to listen. So, and I think about it, maybe they didn't because they themselves didn't know how to actively listen. They just knew that I wasn't actively listening. I just wasn't listening. Oh, interestingly enough, when I read this book, I had an idea that I wasn't a good listener. But after reading this book, I realized to the extent to which I was a bad listener. I mean, it seems like everything the book said not to do, I was actually doing. I was infamous for cutting people off, dismissing people, always judging people. I was listening to respond and react, not necessarily to understand. Another major takeaway I got from this book is that at times there's a gap between what somebody says and what we actually hear. And one of the reasons for that is, who we are and what we are at a particular moment can significantly impact what we actually hear or what we're able to hear. In other words, if anxiety, stress, having low self-esteem, our own internal chatter, negative self-talk, these are all things that can serve as filters that can distort how we hear what somebody is actually saying. This is the reason why I personally believe that active listening is such a critical skill to learn, to practice, and eventually master, because it equips us to be able to circumvent, many of those, potential barriers that could get in the way of us being able to actually listen to what somebody is sharing with us. In addition, active listening today is a very sought after skill in both the dating and the job market. And it makes perfect sense. One thing I learned from this book is that everybody have a need to be heard, to feel heard, to be seen, more importantly, to be understood. And when you think about it, active listening is a skill, is the practice of listening for the sole purpose of understanding. So by practicing active listening, you are equipping yourself with the tools necessary to be able to provide this as an experience for somebody that you're having a conversation with. And a great model, a great example of a master active listener is Oprah. If you want to see what active listening looks like, sounds like, feels like, watch Oprah Super Soul Sundays. Shoot, at times, there's been times where I've watched Oprah interview somebody else and I felt heard. I felt understood. Personally speaking, once I began to practice active listening, I noticed a considerable improvement around the relationships I was able to cultivate and the relationships I currently had. More importantly, as a teacher, one of the ways that active listening has helped me tremendously, I became the model for what active listening is like for my students. And I was able to use myself. That's one of the reasons why I think that learning active listening is so powerful, because in conversation, if you are an effective active listener yourself and you're having a conversation with somebody who perhaps have not learned that skill just yet, you can use yourself as a model to say, hey, remember when you were talking, notice how I allowed you to finish. Notice how I was able to, I pause. Notice how I listen intently. I would like for you to do the same for me. And lastly, I would say this. Anybody that is interested in improving, optimizing their communication skills, active listening is essential for that. Essential. I used to think that if you cared about somebody, you would go talk to them. After reading this book, I learned that if you care about somebody, you will go listen to them. Pause and Listen, The Art of Active Listening is a must read. This is a book I frequently recommend, especially for anybody that is in relationships, who are interested in being in relationships, all types of relationships, especially if you're a parent. This is a book that you must read. This is a very valuable book because it provides you with the tools you could practice and start teaching that to your children. Also, if you're an educator, a must read. If you're a leader in leadership position, it must read. Lots of effective, actionable steps that are also very easy to implement. You could implement those. Some of those you can implement like literally from day one, just like that. If you enjoyed this video, if you found any value in this video, you enjoyed it, I would humbly request that you like this video, you leave a comment, and more importantly, you share it with 3 other people you care about. Spread the wealth.